Hi everyone, welcome back to Dr. Han's Pharmacy Classroom Pro. Now, in this video, we are going to talk about the current or more recent controversies in performance-enhancing drug use. I'm breaking this topic into 3 smaller videos so it would be easier to get through each individual topic. So let's get started. The first part is about the systematic doping in Russia. The systematic doping in Russia began in 2010. Vitaly Stepanov, a former employee of the Russian anti-doping agency or the RUSADA, and his wife, Yulia, a former Russian middle-distance runner, played a crucial role in exposing the state-sponsored doping program in Russia. They provided extensive evidence of systematic doping practices to the World Anti-Doping Agency or the WADA by sending numerous emails and letters over a period of several years. Now, their efforts eventually led to the revelation of a large-scale doping scandal that implicated numerous Russian athletes and officials. Following that, in 2013, a Russian discus thrower who provided evidence to WADA and other anti-doping agency about widespreading doping in Russia as well. Now, she disclosed information about how the system worked and how athletes were involved in doping practices. And according to the New York Times, the email reached 3 top WADA officials, but the agency decided not to open an inquiry, but instead forwarded her email to Russian sports officials. Now, in this case, sending whistleblower information directly to the implicated sports officials instead of conducting an independent inquiry was a failure to protect whistleblowers and address the issues of doping effectively. In 2014, a German journalist released a documentary titled The Doping Secret and How Russia Creates Its Champions, which exposed widespread doping practices and corruption in Russian athletes. The documentary revealed disturbing practices, including the alleged involvement of Russian athletic officials in supplying banned substances to athletes in exchange for a percentage of their earnings. It also suggested that doping control officers and officials falsified tests to hide positive results and allow athletes to compete while using prohibited substances. As time goes on, in November 2015, WADA released a 323-page report. Now, this report detailed the findings of an investigation into allegations of systematic doping and cover-ups in Russian sports, which had initially been exposed in the documentary that we just talked about. Now, the report reviewed several alarming practices. First, Russian police involvement. It revealed that Russian law enforcement regularly visited the Moscow anti-doping laboratory and questioned its staff during the investigation. Some laboratory staff were reportedly instructed not to cooperate fully with WADA's investigation. And second, the report indicated that there was evidence suggesting potential bugging of the laboratory and phone lines, which could have compromised the integrity of the investigation. And third, the All-Russian Athletic Federation was recommended to be declared non-compliant with WADA's anti-doping regulation due to the evidence of widespread doping and cover-ups. Now, this recommendation has significant consequences for Russian athletes' participation in international competition, including the summer 2016 Olympics. And also, the Moscow Anti-Doping Center was prohibited from carrying out any WADA-related anti-doping activity due to its involvement in the scandal. And Russia was banned from hosting international sporting events in 2016 due to the severity of the allegations and evidence of state-sponsored doping. And finally, doping cases involving Russian athletes were referred to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, or CAS for education, ultimately determined the eligibility of Russian athletes to participate in international competitions. And 2 months later, in January 2016, WADA released a second report detailing how the doping occurred. The report mentioned that the former director of a Russian anti-doping agency had been planning to publish a book on doping in Russia since 1987. However, he died before he could complete the book. And following that, Grigory, the former director of the Moscow anti-doping laboratory, was fired by Russian authorities in November 2015, following the initial revelation about the state-sponsored doping program. Now, in the wake of his dismissal and fearing for his safety, he fled to the United States. And in an interview with the New York Times, the former director of the laboratory made explosive allegations regarding the elaborate and systematic doping scheme. He detailed how samples were tampered with to evade detection. Specifically, he claimed that a colleague in the sample collection room would pass urine samples through a hole in the wall near the floor, which were covered with plastic caps. This allowed for the swapping of clean urine for samples containing banned substances. And in June of the same year, WADA released a third report that highlighted issues related to the work of the doping control officers in Russia. Now, some athletes were providing incorrect or misleading location information, including namely the military cities or other locations with restricted access as their whereabouts. Now, this made it difficult or impossible for the doping control officers to reach athletes for testing. Now, some national championships and events, including Olympic qualifiers, were held in city with these restricted access. This prevented the officer from accessing athletes for testing, creating a situation where athletes could potentially avoid being tested. The officers were reported to be under constant monitoring by security staff, which potentially compromised the independence and effectiveness of their work. The report also revealed that athlete samples packages were being opened by Russian customs, raising concern about the integrity of the anti-doping process. A significant portion of Russian athletes did not respond or refused to be interviewed by WADA as part of the investigation, hindering the effort to gather further information and evidence. And as a result of this third report, the International Weightlifting Federation (IWF) imposed a 1-year ban on Russia due to evidence of systematic doping. This ban had implications for Russian weightlifters' participation in international competitions, and the IOC ratified the ban on Russia, preventing the team from competing in the 2016 Summer Olympics. Now, however, some individual Russian athletes were allowed to participate under strict conditions if they met specific anti-doping criteria. A month later, in July 2016, a Canadian lawyer, Richard McLaren, published a report commissioned by the WADA to investigate the allegation made by Grigory, the former director of the Moscow anti-doping laboratory. This report became known as the McLaren Investigation Report. It concluded that there was clear evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that Russia had operated a state-directed system to protect doped Russian athletes. The system was referred to as the disappearing positive methodology, which involved swapping out urine samples containing banned substances with clean samples, effectively evading detection. The McLaren report found that this disappearing positive methodology had been in operation from at least late 2011 to August 2015. This timeframe indicated multiple Olympic Games and other international competitions. This report also identified a staggering 643 positive samples across 31 sports as part of its systematic doping scheme. Now, following the release of this report, WADA announced that the Russian anti-doping agency RUSADA was non-compliant with the WADA code and recommended that Russia to be banned from the 2016 Summer Olympics. In response to the McLaren investigation report, the International Olympic Committee (IOC) initiated a reanalysis and full inquiry into Russian competitors who participated in the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi. Now, the investigation aimed to determine the extent of the doping scheme and to take appropriate action. And in July 2016, the IOC rejected WADA's recommendation to ban Russia entirely from 2016 Summer Olympics. Instead, the decision was left to each individual sport federation, and positive decisions for Russian athletes would need to be approved by a court of arbitration for sport, the arbitrator, and a IOC subcommittee. Now, following that, Russia submitted 389 athletes for participation in the 2016 Summer Olympic, and the IOC cleared 278 of those athletes for participation. However, 111 athletes were removed from the Russian delegation due to their involvement in the doping scandal. In terms of the International Paralympic Committee, it banned the entire Russian team from the 2016 Summer Paralympic, citing widespread evidence of state-sponsored doping. And Russian officials appealed the IPC's decision, but the Court of Arbitration for Sport upheld the decision, so the whole team was banned at that event. Now, following those scandals and different decisions at different level, let's look at one case, the impact on Rio 2016 for a Russian swimmer, Yulia Efimova. Now, for this case, it really highlighted the complexities and challenges in determining the eligibility of athletes with doping history. So on August 4th, 2016, the CAS ruled that this Russian swimmer was not eligible to compete in the Summer Olympic after she appealed an initial decision made by FINA, the international governing body for aquatics. She had previously served a doping ban, which played a role in the decision to initially exclude her from the Olympic. The CAS ruling stipulated that the final decision must be made by the International Olympic Committee. So a day later, on August 5th, 2016, during the Olympic opening ceremony, the IOC ruled that Yulia was eligible to compete in the Olympics. The decision was based on the fact that Yulia had tested negative in 14 recent tests, all of which were conducted outside of Russia. Now, these negative test results were a significant factor in the IOC's decision to allow her participation. Now, although athletes were allowed to participate in the games, the IOC banned the Russian Olympic Committee from the 2018 Winter Olympics. Now, the ban was, an evidence from the McLaren investigation report and further investigation into the doping scheme during the 2014 Winter Olympics. This ban meant that the Russian flag and national anthem would not be featured at the games, and Russian government officials were not allowed to attend. As a result of the investigation, 43 Russian athletes were sanctioned and 13 medals were stripped due to their involvement in the state-sponsored doping scheme. And following the ban, 47 athletes and coaches launched an appeal to the CAS in an attempt to overturn IOC's decision and gain eligibility to participate. However, the appeal was dismissed by the CAS on the day of the opening ceremony of the 2018 Winter Olympics and upholding the IOC's ban. Now, despite the ban on the ROC, Russian Olympic Committee, Russian athletes were allowed to participate under designation Olympic Athletes of Russia, or OAR, provided they must met the strict anti-doping criteria. However, during the 2018 Winter Olympic, two athletes from the OAR delegation, one participated in curling and another one participated in bobsled, failed doping tests. The doping case of both of them were a significant blow to the OAR delegation's effort to demonstrate clean competition. And as a response, the International Olympic Committee stated that the OAR team would not be allowed to parade under the Russian flag at the closing ceremony of the Winter Olympic. And on February 2018, February 28, 2018, the IOC announced that it would reinstate Russians' Olympic membership, ending the suspension imposed on the Russian Olympic Committee. This decision was met with various reactions, as it marked a step toward normalization, but also raised concern about the credibility of anti-doping efforts. Now, even though IOC lifted the ban, but in December 2019, WADA imposed a significant ban on Russia, barring the country from participating in all global sports competitions, including events like the World Cup and the Olympic Games. Now, here the ban is at the country level, okay? Even though the the ban was lifted. The ban was set for a duration of 4 years, and Russia did not appeal the ban imposed by WADA. This decision marked a notable shift from the previous incidences where Russia appealed sanctions related to the doping scandal. And the International Association of Athletic Federation, IAAF, the governing body for track and field events, adopted a specific stance regarding Russian athletes. Now, they said that Russian track and field athletes who had undergone testing by non-Russian anti-doping agency were allowed to compete in international competitions as neutral athletes. However, these athletes were prohibited from competing under the Russian flag, using national colors, or playing the national anthem. And most recently, during the 2020 Summer Olympics and the 2022 Winter Olympics, Russian athletes competed under the banner of the Russian Olympic Committee, ROC. And the ban on Russia, the country itself, is set to end on December 16, 2022. And with the doping scandal in Russia, it sort of set a road, or paved a road for the WADA to undergo some reform. So it has undergone some various reform over the years to enhance its effectiveness in combating doping in sport. Now, these reforms have aimed to address challenges, to improve transparency, strengthen anti-doping effort, and restore confidence in the integrity of sports competitions.